things like that. Chimpanzees and other apes don't have that, but they do definitely teach their offspring. And that's not even unique to apes. Most animals, you know, if you've got cats, you've seen the parents teaching the young how to hunt and things like that. So transmission of information from one generation to the next is not unique to human beings. Tool use, again, I mentioned the chimps making spears to hunt. They've also found things where certain tribes of chimps use one type of tool for cracking nuts open, another one uses something else, so again, culture and tool use. And then self-recognition, this one's kind of tricky. You've heard of the mirror test. Basically what you do is you set up a mirror, you put a dot on something's head, and you see if they pat at their own head to remove the dot, or if they pat at the mirror to try and figure out. This is sometimes taken as a sign of self-awareness. The problem with that is that it doesn't really work that way in reality. There are a lot of animals that when you show them a mirror, they act as if the mirror were another animal. Birds are well known for this, dogs and cats are known for this. But there are also animals that respond to the mirror as representing themselves. Elephants, dolphins, some of the apes, not all of them. But it turns out that if you take a human being, not all human beings respond to it the same way. Certain types of autism and things like that that affect what we would call self-awareness sometimes affect the mirror behavior and sometimes they don't. So it's difficult to say exactly what the mirror test is really showing. I've read a lot of different ideas. One that I think makes reasonable sense is that the organism recognizes that there's something in the mirror that's a copy of something in the environment, and they learn to associate it with them. But whether that means they're self-aware or not is a debatable question. But we don't have a good definition of consciousness, so we can't define it for us. It's going to be hard to tell if other animals have something approaching what we have anyway. In terms of differences, like I said, if there's 98.77% similarity, we have about 1.23% differences. But what those differences mean can be really important. One important gene that has differences between us and chimps is one called the FOX2P, I think it is, that seems to be involved in developing the structures we use for language. So even though it's a small genetic difference, the physical effects are huge, and this is why chimpanzees don't have the ability to use language, spoken language. There's been some attempts to train them in terms of sign language and computer keyboards and things like that, but they definitely cannot physically produce vocal language of the type that we use. Although they do make different sounds, and those different sounds may be used for different meanings, it's hard to tell, but they definitely don't have a language approaching the complexity of human language. In terms of behavior, in most primates, the male is not involved in child rearing at all. He's usually not even present in most of them. In the case of things like gorillas and chimpanzees that live in troops, there's usually a male present, but he has no interactions with the offspring beyond the act of creating them in the first place. The peacekeeping mechanisms, in the case of most primates, including humans, peacekeeping usually involves some form of physical touch. You know, we shake hands after a fight, or we kiss and make up. These are kind of the ideas you hear about. In the case of bonobos, they actually have sex to make up. I mean, when they've had a fight, they have sex, which most people wouldn't do. You know, you're at work, you have a fight with somebody, you don't normally, I hope, anyway. And as I said earlier, language, while some chimps have, and some gorillas have been taught things like American Sign Language and keyboards with symbols on them, they've never approached anything like the complexity of combinations and grammar that humans have. But that's not really a big deal. We really shouldn't expect that. You can also look at the anatomy. This shows what's called a morphometric grid. Basically, you take a structure, you lay this grid on top of it, and then you compare that structure at a later time, and you see how much you had to move the grid to make the same points be on the grid. So this is showing the skull of a human fetus, which it turns out a chimpanzee fetus has a skull that looks pretty much exactly like this. So you can take this as a human fetus or a chimp fetus. Here's a human adult skull. You can see the grid has been somewhat bent, especially in the back regions of the skull, but otherwise it's basically the same. The proportions and everything have been fairly maintained. This is why kids have kind of a big head, because it already has almost adult-like proportions. If you were to take a chimpanzee and do the same thing, the chimpanzee adult's head, you've got a much larger transformation that's occurred. So what seems to have happened is that what humans have done is they've retained juvenile characteristics. In terms of our head and facial structure, what we look like is babies. So chimpanzee babies look like human babies. Chimpanzee adults do not look like human adults because they've gone on and made these other large-scale changes. And there's a lot of stuff, I talked about some of this with the Evo-Devo stuff way back in that lecture, about the fact that changing the timing of development can produce these sorts of changes very easily. So again, small genetic changes can produce big modifications. and as a result lead to big differences between the organisms. Obviously there's a lot of other differences. Chimpanzees are much stronger than an adult human being. There's all sorts of things like that that go along with it, but there's a lot of basic similarities. In terms of social interactions, there's a lot of different ways that primates work in groups depending on the species you're studying. Chimpanzees, the ones that are closest to us, do tend to have these troops, and you find some similarities there between humans and chimpanzees that are, in my opinion, nearly indistinguishable. One of the most important ones is the idea of territoriality, which just means that this is mine and that's yours, and if you come into mine, I'm going to beat you up over it. Nothing different than having a fence in your backyard. There's a Far Side cartoon, which I didn't have time to find, where there's a dad talking to his son and saying, oh yeah, the birds have to sing to defend their territories because they're much less advanced than they are. But you see, he's standing in the backyard with a fence, and his neighbor has a fence with a keep out sign, the next neighbor has a fence with a keep out sign. This is not something unique to human beings. We have our own space, whatever you want to call that space, and most animals do the same thing. And to go along with that, there's the idea of xenophobia, which just means if you're not from my group, then I don't want you to be here. This goes back, insects have this. It's not something even unique to mammals, that if you take a honeybee out of its hive and put it in another hive, they will immediately attack it because it doesn't smell right. Wasps do the same thing. If you take that bee and you make it smell correctly and then put it in a new hive, they'll treat it as if it belongs there. In our case, we have other ways of identifying. We have flags, we have accents, we have symbols that we wear that identify what groups we belong to, but it's the same idea. That, when I came down here and went into a Waffle House and the first, I said whatever I wanted, you're not from around here, are you? It was one of the first things that I was told when I moved to the South. I mean, clearly there are things that we use to tell you don't belong in my group or you do belong in my group. And these kinds of things make a big difference. We can see this sort of thing in animal behavior all the time. Wolf packs defend their territories very aggressively. Chimpanzees do it. Gorillas do it to a lesser extent. Humans do it. Again, you might not be able to read this one. It just says, this shows the cast of Star Trek, and the statement says, well, around here we don't cotton to strangers who show up in our town to run some lame go back in time episode because they ran out of production money. The Star Trek did quite a few of those types of things, but the same idea applying that, you're not from around here, are you, is a common response. What are you looking at? The Jersey way of saying something very similar is a well-known human behavior. And so this is something that goes back in time, that the animals who defended their territory had the resources they needed to feed and take care of their offspring, and then they passed on those traits for territoriality to their offspring, and so it spread through the population. You can also talk about kin selection, which is the idea that you tend to favor your relatives over your non-relatives. And this kind of goes back to that selfish gene idea, because if you have a trait that says, I'll help out my brother but not a stranger, then your brother has copies of your genes too, because you're related genetically 50%. So the odds are that if you have a gene that says help your brother, then he has a gene that says hopefully help you in return. And so by helping each other, you help pass on the copies of the gene that favor your family. And so it's not uncommon to find the exact same thing in animals, where their behavior is determined by family relationships, which is why you find a lot of animals where the one sex or the other stays in place. Males or females, depends on the species. But those individuals are staying in place because they're all related and they know how to treat one another based on their relationships. Whereas human beings, we have a little bit more complicated way of doing it, keeping track of things like first cousins and third cousins and whatever. But basically we do treat relatives differently. I mean, if you see some random person on the street asking for $1, and you see your brother or sister asking the same question, I'm going to bet you that most of us would be more willing to give money to our sister. Well, okay. I got a brother that I'm not so sure about. But generally, if you don't have a freeloading relative, you might be willing to give them money more likely than a random stranger that you met somewhere. And the same thing goes back to this idea of the nuclear family. The mother, the father, the 2.5 offspring, and all of that stuff. That's just the same idea. These are the group of people that I know that I should help out in time of need. And whether it's a troop of chimpanzees or the Simpsons, the same results apply, that you give your help to those that you're related to, because in the long run, that will help your genes too.